It's Friday, another week has bled right by, and we're back with another episode of the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Beyond the Darkness. A little later, we've got a brand new Theater of the Mind coming up for you, and this is a cool episode. I love when we can talk to people in authority that have had experiences and are willing to come forward and share. Our guest has been a guest multiple times on Coast to Coast AM. This is his first appearance on Darkness Radio or Beyond the Darkness. Paul Rimash is graduated with a bachelor's degree in forensic science and a minor in photography. He's worked as a crime scene investigator for the Weber Metro CSI for the past 20 years. And he has had some interesting experiences. He's here to share with us this evening. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
This is, like I said, this is cool. You know, I've got law enforcement throughout my family, and on occasion I've heard stories of strange happenings and weird calls, and a lot of times they'll just write it off as the person's lonely or bored or maybe on too many drinks or drugs that night when they're hearing these experiences. But they don't like to talk about it in any kind of public forum. They refuse to come forward and talk about the experiences that have been outside the normal, really weird experiences that they can't explain away as easily as the rest. Why are you so open about this?
Well, that's a good question, and I've experienced that too. That people in law enforcement and science jobs and things of that nature really are hesitant to talk about it. But I think it goes back to the way I was trained to think when I was a rookie crime scene investigator. And I was trained by a guy named Russ Dean, just an amazing crime scene investigator. He was also a detective and a patrolman for years, and he currently teaches up at Weber State University in their criminal justice department. And the way Russ taught me to think is, I think, why I can deal and talk with some of these things. And the kind of the way it works is with mainstream science, the people who are always the skeptics, the people who are always against the paranormal and the strange, they're taught to think using deductive reasoning. And the way deductive reasoning works, it's the scientific method that you hear about a lot, where you have a theory that you start out with, and then you seek evidence or experimentation to prove your theory. And then once you've gone through enough of these tests or experimentation, then you can say, well, yes, my theory was correct, or no, my theory was not correct. The trouble with that line of thinking, or that way of thinking, is a lot of times it can lead to what's called anchoring, where you have your theory that you've started your research on, you're working on your PhD or whatever with this theory, and even though evidence starts to pile up against your original theory, you're anchored to it, you're invested in it, you've made your living writing books on it or whatever, that you have a hard time letting that theory go. And you see that a lot, I mean, especially in the realm of like forbidden archaeology and different things like that, where they say, nope, humans came across the Bering Strait 15,000 years ago, and then any evidence that is contrary to that, they're not going to listen to because they're anchored to that theory. But the way I was taught, the way I was brought up in the business by Russ, is to think more inductively. And so that's more of a bottom-up approach. And it was always amazing to watch Russ work a crime scene. You'd go into a scene, you got blood, you got guts, you got bullet holes, you got all this stuff. And people, it's kind of the inclination of people to start making theories like, oh, I think this happened and this happened and this happened. But the way Russ did it is he would slowly just start looking at everything. He would observe, he would take it all in, he would, examine this small piece of evidence, he would examine that small piece. And while everyone else is, popping off with these theories, he wouldn't really say anything. And so he would go through and look and look and look. And then eventually, after he had looked enough, and that could be days, that could be weeks, he would come up with his theory as to what happened at the crime scene, and the dude was never wrong. And he always warned us, as we were young rookies, to avoid tunnel vision. That was his phrase. Don't get tunnel vision. And so that's really the way I was trained. And so when we look at these paranormal activities or these different strange things that happen, something's going on. Like, people are experiencing something, people are seeing something, and because of that bottom-up approach, I can't just dismiss it out of hand. I can't say, well, they're all crazy, or they're all drunk, or they're all on drugs, or whatever. Something's happening. The way I was trained to think, I have to just, maybe I don't know what it is, but I have to admit that something out of the normal is happening.
Does it concern you, being especially a crime scene investigator, if you're ever called into court for your expertise regarding a crime and your insight, that someone upon cross-examination can say, Your Honor, and members of the jury, our guest also believes in ghosts and the paranormal. As a matter of fact, he's been on paranormal radio shows talking about these topics. Do you worry that kind of could throw your career into a little bit of a tailspin?
I have thought about it, but I wouldn't say it would throw me into a tailspin, because I would explain it, just like I have. I mean, people experience things, and, I guess I'm more of a story collector in this regard. I mean, I don't consider myself a hardcore paranormal researcher or a ghost hunter or anything like that. I'm more interested in collecting people's stories. And so I would just basically, if it came down to it, I would just explain it like we've talked about. I mean, people are experiencing something. You can dismiss some of it, but you can't really dismiss all of it. And yeah, so it hasn't come up yet, and yeah, maybe it will one day. But fortunately, out here in Utah, I think a lot of people believe in the paranormal or have kind of a religious or spiritual side. So I don't think it would really tank my career if that ever came up.
The idea that there are these unexplained moments, and you've talked to other investigators and law enforcement officials that have had them. When you're talking to them about this, I'm sure, is it one-on-one? Do they talk in groups about what they've had and what they've experienced? And have you ever had officers back up and corroborate each other when they run into these weird instances?
Well, it's funny, like you said at the beginning, people in law enforcement do seem very reticent to talk about things. And so it reminds me earlier, well, it was around Halloween. We had a forensic conference of people from Utah, Nevada, and some of the surrounding states. We all got together for a conference, and there was a banquet at night, and they had, as a theme, kind of made it Halloween themed, and some of the people who were putting on the conference knew that I collected stories, and I actually have compiled a lot of these stories into book form. And the book of these stories is coming out next spring, according to my publisher. So I have a good collection that will be coming out here in a few months. But so they knew that I had collected it and I'd written this book, and so they asked me to speak at the conference. And so I told some different stories, and then they kind of opened it up. They opened the mic up and said, hey, if anyone else has had any experiences, you can come share it with the group now. Nobody stood up. And so they, closed off that portion of it and went just to back to dinner and mingling. Well, as I went around and worked the tables and talked to different people, most everyone, once I got to their table, or most every table had at least one story where they said, hey, I didn't want to get up and tell everybody, but this happened to me. And another person at another table would have a different story. And so, yeah, people do seem hesitant to talk about it in public, but if you get them one-on-one, and if they trust you, then they're more likely to tell. Now, what goes in my favor is that if you have a family in law enforcement, you kind of know this, that the storytelling culture in law enforcement is really big and important. Cops and forensic people love to tell stories. And you have a lot of downtime. So on TV, on the forensic shows on TV or the cop shows on TV, there's nonstop action and there's shootouts and there's all this action and fun things like that. Well, in reality, in law enforcement, there's a lot of downtime. Like it's hurry up and wait all the time, whether that's waiting for a search warrant to be signed or waiting for the medical examiner to show up before you can start to examine a body, or waiting for a call in the middle of a winter night to come in. There's a lot of downtime, and so officers love to tell stories. And so I've been able to kind of take advantage of that storytelling culture, where in moments where people are talking and different things, I can say, hey, has anything ever happened to you? Or, bring it up like that. And yeah, in one-on-one or in small groups, people are willing to share, and actually more willing than I actually thought when I started out collecting the stories.
Now, what about your experiences? Do you believe in the paranormal? Did you have experiences growing up at all? Anything that maybe family told stories? Anything along those lines?
Well, it's funny. So I grew up in Utah, and I'm a Mormon, and our culture, the Mormon culture, is a really spiritual culture. And so if you went to a church on Sunday and talked to some other Latter-day Saints and said, hey, I had a dream last night where my grandfather came to me and told me about a problem that I had, or he helped me solve a problem. And when I woke up in the morning, I did what he told me and everything worked out. Stories like that happen all the time, or it's very prevalent to have different things like that in Mormon culture. So I grew up thinking and, believing that the spirit world was very close, that your dead ancestors were interested in you and they could visit you if you needed to. And so, yeah, I had no problem just with the culture I grew up in thinking that those things could happen.
Now, as you start to approach law enforcement, you're especially as a crime scene investigator, noticing every detail. What do you look at now when somebody starts to tell you about an experience? Have you been in a home or been in a location when somebody's sharing what's going on? Have you been able to then kind of look and assess just by a quick cursory glance of, well, I think it may just be rodents, or it might be this or that? Do you ever get that kind of cue when you're talking to these people or looking around?
That's a good question. And I don't think I've ever had a story told to me while I was at a scene like that. I'm trying to think. A lot of times it's more after the fact. But one of the interesting things that I look for, not for necessarily on-site information like that, mm-hmm. but a lot of the stories that I've heard only, how do I put this? So knowing what happened at the crime scene and then hearing about the story later, only someone who had experienced the crime scene would have had that information. And let me tell you a story that's a good example of that.
Please.
So when I was a young CSI, we had a murder of a beautiful young lady. Her and her husband were in the process of getting divorced, but he got really drunk one night. It turned into a if I can't have her, nobody can type of situation, and he killed her. It was actually an extremely brutal murder with a knife. Oh. And it was, one of the first really nasty crime scenes that I'd ever worked. And, it's obviously something, pretty traumatic. And, but we worked the scene. We were there like every day for about 2 weeks. The case came and went. We were able to get a successful resolution from it. And I thought it was kind of in the rearview mirror. Now, the important detail is that the woman, as she was running away from her husband, got trapped against an outward opening door. So this door opened outward. She was probably trying to get into that room to lock herself in, but because the door opened outward, she was trapped against it and murdered right there in front of that door. And so, that information wasn't really out to the media. It was just one of those small little details that we only knew from the crime scene. Well, several years later, it was in an apartment building. The apartment had been cleaned up. It had been re-rented, and didn't think anything of it. Well, one day an officer who had actually worked on that crime scene with us got a call back to that exact apartment for just an unrelated dispute. The people in the apartment weren't even in trouble. It was a noise complaint or something like that. And just a minor kind of public order function of the police. So he's there, he's taking the report, and the whole time he's in the apartment, he's thinking, man, this is weird. This is where the murder was. He was reliving it. He was thinking about it, but he did not say anything to the man and the woman who lived in the apartment. Well, he took the report for the noise issue or whatever it was, and he was getting ready to leave. And the woman who lived in the apartment said, "Hey, I hate to ask, but wasn't somebody murdered in these apartments?" And the officer, Mike, he said he felt kind of the blood drain out of his head. You know what I mean? He's like, oh, he doesn't know what to say. He doesn't want to freak these people out, but he's like, yes, there was a murder in these apartments. And the woman says, can you tell me which unit it was in? And at this point, Mike is feeling a little bit nervous, and he's like, well, are you sure you want to know? And the lady said, yeah, I want to know. And he's like, well, it was this one. And so he expected them to act really, freaked out or strange or whatever. But the woman just nodded, and the guy sitting on the couch watching the TV, the man who lived there, said, well, that explains a few things. And so, Mike couldn't, he didn't want to talk about it, but he couldn't really let that go. And he said, well, why do you ask? Well, what the whole point of this, to your question, is that they told that officer that every now and again, that door that the female victim had been trapped against and murdered, that particular door, would open by itself, and the light for that room would turn on. Mm. And so, Mike was like, oh, okay. And, just kind of did his dealings and then left. And I heard about that story later. And so to your question, I hadn't done any on-site, investigation of that paranormal activity, but it has specific information. How would they know that particular door is the one she was trapped against? Like I said, wasn't in the media, but it seems to be that that's where the energy or whatever was focused. And so, I consider that story pretty credible because it's specific information. And so, yeah, there's several examples where there's just things that have happened, and how else would they have known without, some validity to their story?
As a police officer, in talking to different police officers, do they admit to having somewhat of a sixth sense about situations and people themselves? Because it's been in my findings, a lot of the cops I know do. They definitely have the spidey sense that seems to kick in, and they use it on a daily basis for their career. Yeah, I'd say so.
But let me back up for one sec. For full disclosure, I am not an officer. I'm a civilian crime scene investigator. So.
Okay. Well, but I mean, working with the officers and doing what you do, sure.
Well, I just don't want any stolen glory, or what do they call that?
Yeah, I understand.
People pose as cops or veterans or active military. I don't want any of that going on. So.
Right.
I am what I am. But yeah, I would say that they do, especially the longer they work in the field. And that reminds me of another story that has a lot to do with that sixth sense kicking in.
Hot damn, we're on a roll. Let's hear it.
Well, I got stories all day. So there was an officer. He works in our jurisdiction now, but he was a rookie back east in New England. And so one night he drove out into this really deserted part it was close to the coast, and there was that really tall beach grass all over the place, this road he was parked in. And he went down there to type a report, but it was really late. There was a nice warm breeze, and the radio was quiet. And so despite his best efforts, he nodded off a little bit. And while he was, he doesn't know how long he was asleep. He was just kind of quickly nodded off. All of a sudden, his alarm bells, or the spidey sense that you were talking about, kicked in. And he knew something was there. He woke up fully awake because of that sensation of something bad is about to happen. As soon as he woke up, and as soon as he regained full awareness and consciousness, he heard the laughter of two small children outside of his car. Just the little giggling that you hear on those horror movies when the kid ghosts are around. Oh. And he heard that, and so he looked out of the window. He got all around the car. Nobody was there. Nobody could have really snuck up on him. He jumped in his car and took off. And so, the senses, the spidey sense, as you said, definitely exists. And this time, it wasn't warning him of someone with a gun in their pocket. It was, who knows, two creepy kid ghosts. That's what it was warning.
That's enough for me. Thank you for that kind of warning. What about creepy stories? Let me hear some of your favorite creepers that you've been able to collect.
Well, it's funny. I think, like I said, when I started collecting these stories for writing them down in a book, I really just was trying to, like I said, put them all together, just kind of compile them. More of like this is a campfire kind of volume of stories, just so you can share. I wasn't really trying to analyze things, but it's funny how different patterns of the stories kind of emerged. And one of the really interesting patterns that I think has emerged, and I've heard different paranormal researchers talk about this on your show and Coast to Coast and different things. What is a haunting? So is a haunting an actual ghost, an actual spirit, disembodied or lost soul that's wandering around, or is it some kind of echo in the space? Like right. The place has captured this moment, and it's just replaying it somehow, like a video cassette or whatever. And it's funny, a lot of researchers, pitch their tent in one of those groups or the other, but I would say that I kind of think that it might be both. That some of them are spirits, some of them are captured moments, and just the energy's captured. And so one of the most interesting stories that's going to be in my book is that it appears that I am haunting our crime scene unit, our building. I am haunting it.
Okay.
And so here's the story. So
let's hear this.
It sounds really weird, but so I've had multiple coworkers who were alone in our building hear my voice. So one time, one of my coworkers was back in the records room. She was alone in the office. It was 3 a.m. Right behind her, she hears me say her name. And she says it's clear as day. She thought, what's Paul doing here? She turns around. Nobody's there. She thinks I'm playing a trick on her, searches the whole building, no cars, no nothing. She gets freaked out, heads out. So a few, say, months later, another one of my coworkers is back in the lab and hears me call her name from the other room. She hears me clear as day call her name. She's like, oh, Paul's here, walks there, nobody's there. So, and then another coworker later heard me sneeze. I have a really distinctive sneeze. I inherited it from my dad. God rest his soul. And if you knew me, you'd know my sneeze. So she hears me sneeze, goes around. I'm not there at all. And so they were all really freaked out by this. But it leaves me to the question. So I am not dead, hopefully. If
Somebody forgot to tell you. Sorry about that, Paul.
Maybe. You have the best Skype connection in the world if I am dead. So I'm not dead, but why are these coworkers experiencing me like I was a ghost, a traditional kind of haunting thing that you might think of. And so it just leads me to think, well, is my energy trapped there somehow after 20 years of kicking around that place? Is my part of my soul or whatever in the bricks? I mean, I don't know. It's really weird. And so, but those stories aren't too creepy. You wanted a really creepy story. This one, I think, might belong in that kind of captured energy. And so this story was one that was told to me at that gathering I spoke of earlier, that forensic conference, when I went around to the tables and, no one would speak publicly, but they had an abundance of stories for me later. So there was a woman, a single mother and a daughter who moved into this apartment. And they, everything was going fine. And the girl was about 5. So she had been potty trained for, a few years, no problems or anything like that. Well, all of a sudden, this girl starts wetting the bed. And, it happens once, if you have kids, sometimes accidents happen.
Right.
You not to freak out. It happens once, no big deal. Well, this girl who was, like I said, about 5, starts wetting the bed every night. Finally, her mom's like, honey, what is the problem? Why are you wetting the bed? You've been potty trained for years. What's the problem? And the little girl, looks kind of scared and nervous and says, well, I don't want to go into the bathroom anymore at night because there's a lady in there. And the mom's like, okay, well, what's the lady doing? And the little girl's like, well, she's sitting in the bathtub in red water. And at that point, the mom's like, okay.
Oh, right.
What's going on here?
Okay.
So the mom, starts to ask around a little bit, and none of her neighbors knew of anything weird that had happened there. She just went around, and so she finally talked to the manager about it, who had been there for several years, and the manager's like, oh, yeah, well, it's been a while, but several years ago, a woman committed suicide in your apartment in the bathtub. She slit her wrists in the tub, and they found her dead with the water filled with blood. And, at that point, the woman is just horrified because she's like, what, my daughter is seeing this. and so, I mean, those stories, kind of make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. But what is it? Like, is that woman still there haunting the place? Or is this 5-year-old somehow tapping into the strong emotional energy that was left there? And so there's a lot of different questions that I have. What is the true nature of some of these experiences? But then there's other experiences that don't fit this pattern of, trapped energy as well. And the story that I'm referring to is also another child. So in this story, a woman she had been leading a rough life, and her kids had been taken away from her by Child Protective Services, and she'd been hanging out with some bad people and, was into drugs. Well, she was in the process of making her life better. She was off of drugs. She was, trying not to hang out with these friends anymore. She was really turning her life around, and she was granted some conditional visits with her children. So on the weekends, her kids could come and stay with her and spend some time with her, and then they would go home and be with the people that had custody of her. And so anyway, the kids came on one weekend, had a good visit with mom, went home. Well, a couple days later, this woman doesn't show up for work, and her coworkers call it in. The officers go to her house, and she's been murdered. And another knife attack, really ugly crime scene. This poor gal had been cut down. Well, is any good investigator will do. a detective, and this is more of what the detectives do as opposed to us, a detective is going to want to talk to all the friends and family of a murdered person, because statistically you're much more likely to be murdered by someone you know than a stranger. Stranger murders happen, but like I said, statistically, people who know you are the ones who want to kill you. That's comforting, right? But
no, I've been married twice. I believe that completely.
Okay. You're on page with me there.
Yes.
Anyway, so they go and they go and talk to the family, and the investigators, the detectives, want to talk to these daughters, the woman's children, to see if while they were there on the weekend, something strange had been going on. If mom had seemed upset, or if anyone was hanging around that were scaring her. They just wanted to try to find out what was going on. Now, the trouble is the daughters at this point don't know that their mother has been murdered. And so it's one of those dilemmas, should the detectives tell them and have them freak out and be useless as potential information sources, or do they get information from them first and then tell? And they opted, since the girls were kind of young, to try to get information from them first and then tell them their mother was dead. So these girls did not know their mom was dead. So while they're waiting, the detectives are there and they're talking to the adult guardians of these children, and they mention the mother. Well, the young girl perks up and says, "Oh, were you guys talking about my mommy?" And the detectives were like, "Yeah, we were talking about your mommy." And the youngest daughter said, "Oh, she came to see me last night." And at that point, the detective, once again, he feels the blood drain from his face, because last night the mother was dead. She had been killed earlier in the day. There's no possible way this girl, could have seen her mother last night. And so at that point, the adults kind of don't know what to say. And so they're like, "Oh, well, what happened? Like, you saw her?" And she's like, "Oh, yes, I was in bed sleeping, and mommy came into the room and woke me up." And they're like, "Oh," the detectives and the grown-ups like, "Oh, well, what happened then?" And the girl said, "Well, she told me that she had to go away for a long time, but she wanted me to know that she loved me and that I would be okay. And then she left." So at that point, I mean, what do you say to that? The detectives and the grown-ups were just kind of, they kind of stepped back a little bit, and then they eventually, broke the news to them. But that story fits into a category that I wouldn't say is an echo. That's more of a visitation. The person came and interacted with the child. It wasn't just something that she saw. She interacted with her. And so, what are these experiences? I don't think you can put them into one or the other container. I think they kind of fit different paradigms.
Fascinating stuff. We've got a lot more to cover tonight, and I want to dip into some more of your favorite stories as we continue doing this. But right now, it's time to dust off the covers of the archives and dig deep for a new edition of Theater of the Mind.
The Key Holder by an anonymous police officer. Myself and a buddy on my squad responded to an alarm. The incident location was an old office-type building that had been converted to a doctor's office. There was a pharmacy attached to it. Our dispatch received a motion signal from an upstairs office. The key holder arrives on scene, and we go in to secure the building. The stairs were locked behind a door that, of course, the key holder didn't have keys to. So we took the elevator up to the second floor. Not the most tactically sound option, I know. The elevator opens to a pitch-black hallway, except for one overhead light at the end of the hall. We start checking doors, and so far, all are secured. We get to the last office, and sure enough, the door is unlocked. We make entry and observe it to be an unused office. The door opened to a sizable waiting room and reception area. There were about 10 to 12 exam rooms. All were cleared with no hiccups. We exit the office, and immediately something seems a little off. That's when I realized the overhead light at our end of the hallway that had been on was now off. It was replaced by another light over by the elevators. I look at my squad mate, and he is completely white. I ask him what's wrong, and he says, "Weren't all those doors we just checked closed and locked?" I tell him, "Yeah." So my buddy says, "Well, now they're all standing open." Sure enough, all the offices down the hallway we had just checked were now standing open. The pucker factor sinks in at this point. So we start clearing offices and securing offices. We finish the last office, and on our way out, just before we turn the corner to get into the waiting area, the main door just slams shut. Then our radios start going nuts. Some kind of static feedback. Now I just want to get the hell out of there. We get back in the elevator and head down to the first floor to make contact with the key holder again. However, the key holder is nowhere to be found. I contact the dispatch and request a callback number for the key holder so I can advise them of what we found. Dispatch states that the key holder was still en route to us and was advising an ETA of like 5 minutes. I advised dispatch that we had already been out with the key holder. Dispatch requests that I give him a call. So I call dispatch, and she tells me that there's no way we were out with a key holder. She states that the alarm company had only just made contact with one. Eventually, the real key holder arrives on the scene, and I ask her about the man that had let us in the building, which was the first key holder. She asked me to describe him, so I did. She stated that that sounds like one of the doctors that used to lease the office on the second floor at the end of the hall. She then states that he had committed suicide at his summer home several days ago. I still, to this day, won't go back in that building.
Beyond the darkness.
Welcome back to the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Beyond the Darkness. Paul Rimash, our guest this evening, as we're talking about really cool kind of paranormal encounters with law enforcement and the like. And Paul is working steadfastly on a book, which you said should be out probably early part of 2018. Is that right?
Yep, that's when it's scheduled to come out.
Fingerprints and Phantoms. You'll have to watch for that book, and certainly when it releases, we will let our broad audience know about it and post links so that you can find it. And we're talking about some of the stories that he's going to cover in that book tonight as we're delving into this very strange world. The people that tell you these stories and the ones that share these encounters with you, has anybody ever come back to you later and said, yeah, you know, I might have embellished that a little bit, or, hey, I was just pulling your leg, Paul, to see how much of this you'd buy?
No, never. In fact, a lot of times, well, not a lot of times, let me back up. So every now and again, an officer will tell me a story and I chalk it up to the paranormal, but they don't necessarily. And I have an example of that. So not too far from where I'm sitting is the Ogden Cemetery. And it's a really old cemetery for Utah standards. You know, Utah kind of, in 1847, the pioneers came, and so a lot of, you know, we don't have the really old history like back east. But so the Ogden Cemetery is pretty old, and in the Ogden Cemetery there is a famous grave. And so the name on the grave is Florence. And it's kind of interesting. The story around this particular person and ghost that haunts this cemetery is kind of like it fits into the kind of archetype of a person who was killed by a car waiting for their lover, and then when they see headlights, then sometimes motorists will see them. Yeah, I've heard lots of stories from different parts of the country that kind of fit this. So, but supposedly with this ghost, if you go up near her grave and flash your headlights in a certain way, then you'll see this blue mist or a figure of her. There's kind of some different variations of it. And so a lot of times officers will go someplace secluded to write their reports. Now, the reason they do this is because anytime an officer's parked somewhere kind of in a public area, people are going to come talk to them. They're going to say, hey, my neighbor's doing drugs, or hey, I have a fix-it ticket or something like that. They can't really get peace when they're parked somewhere. And if they want to type their reports, they'll go behind a building or in an alley or in a cemetery where people aren't going to bother them so they can write their reports. So several officers I know have had experiences with seeing this ghost flow. But one officer I talked to, when I was really actively gathering these stories, I said, hey, have you ever had any ghost stories? He's like, well, I was in the cemetery once and I was writing my report, and all of a sudden I saw this blue mist come over a hill, and it was really low to the ground, and I kind of looked around and thought, well, maybe a car's coming with those weird LED headlamps, and it's making just some fog on the ground, but no cars were coming, and the mist just got closer and closer and closer, and it was glowing blue, and then it eventually just disappeared, and that was it. And I was like, oh, wow, that sounds like Flow. That sounds like the ghost of Flow. Were you scared? And the officer's like, well, no, I don't believe in ghosts. And I was like, oh, okay, because it fit the perfect pattern of what many people had seen with Flow, but he didn't believe it. He wasn't out there looking for Flow. He didn't even have any expectations of seeing this ghost, but he saw and experienced something anyway. And so once again, I would chalk that up as a pretty credible story because he didn't have any bias. He wasn't looking for that. It just happened to him.
Yeah, those are the best kind of stories, right? No preconceived notions, no front loading, no expectations, and all of a sudden, bam, they're part of the legend now.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, I mean, he didn't seek me out. He wasn't trying to exaggerate. He just had this experience, and he wasn't going to chalk it up to ghosts because he didn't believe it. So
let me ask you this. As a crime scene investigator, then, when you get on scene, are the bodies still there? I mean, is the crime scene still in its pristine set, or do you come in after they've removed the body and look for the evidence after there?
Ideally, the body is still there, and most of the time they are. So that's really one of the most important functions that we fulfill as crime scene investigators is documenting the scene as it is with no changes made to it. Because you don't always know what's important or what's really crucial to that crime scene maybe until a couple days later when the suspect has been interviewed or some new information comes to light. It's not like TV where they walk in and Grissom or Sherlock or whatever can just deduce everything that happened there because of some magical powers of
what? That's not true, Paul?
Nope, I know. It's a shocker.
Does it help you, though, to have the Who music playing behind you when you're in there investigating?
No, it's funny. I remember back when that show first started, the very first Las Vegas one, one of my coworkers came and said, hey, did you know they're making a show about our job? And I'm like, oh, they are? And I was kind of interested in it. And I made it through the first episode and a half, and I couldn't watch anymore. I can't watch those shows at all because, yeah, they are just so outrageously overblown. And I mean, it's basically science fiction, what goes on in those shows. And so, yeah, I'm not a big fan.
Well, let's get back to the exploration of this. When you've been on a site, have you ever felt like maybe you're not alone, like the spirit of the victim might still be there with you?
Oh yeah, all the time. And I think there's two stories that have to do with that. And the second part of it, the second story is really what kind of got me interested in gathering these stories. So we'll get to that in a second. But the homicide I mentioned, where the officer went back later and spoke to the people and they knew about the door, even though they shouldn't have. So while we were in that scene, you could feel the victim's spirit, ghost, whatever you want to put it. You could feel it. Like it was like she was standing right over your shoulder. And it got to the point where every time we would walk into the door, we would greet her. We would say, hello, victim's name, we're here again, and it felt like she was there. And it wasn't just me that experienced it. Everybody who worked that scene had that same sensation. And it doesn't always happen, but a lot of times it does. And that one was so pronounced. I mean, you wouldn't have been surprised if you had turned around and seen her right behind you. It was that palpable, that sensation.
Do you ever, how do I put this? Do you ever ask for their help? Help me find out how this happened. Help me, give me information. Have you ever done that and then suddenly had kind of a aha moment directly after that?
Oh, so you are leading right up to my next story with that question. It's like I had written these stories out in advance for you. So, all right. So the second story that I was referring to has everything to do with that question you just asked. So, I'll start at the beginning. And this woman was, once again, there's a horrible pattern in murders that happens that is just, we need to do something as a society about this. But when a man and a woman are estranged or in a domestic violence situation, there are a lot of homicides that come from that. And it's so tragic that people that were once in love and together, it just gets so bad that there's a murder. But it happens all the time, all over the country. It's really horrible. And this was another circumstance like that, where a man and a woman were married, but they were estranged. He shows up at her work at Burger King and kidnaps her and takes her away from the scene. So her coworkers call in and say, hey, our coworker was abducted by her husband. He was driving this vehicle, such and such. So they go out looking for them. They arrive at her parents' house, and the guy's truck is there. And it turns into a standoff situation. And eventually, during the standoff, the husband murders his estranged wife and her mother. But the victim's father was able to get away once the shooting started. So we had a scene with two deceased females in it, a daughter and a mother. And it was just a really, really sad scene because you think, okay, who had to watch who die? Like, did a mom have to watch her daughter die, or did a daughter have to watch her mother die? Just really gut-wrenching. And so, like we talked about earlier, when we get there, the bodies are in the scene. They leave them there until we get our initial photos and video and different things that we have to do to document the scene. Well, while we were there investigating the scene, one of my dear, dear friends, his name is Mitch. He started out with us, but he's works for a different agency now. But he was alone in the house with the two dead bodies, the two victims. And he was sitting there. He was kind of young at the time, a young investigator, and he was standing right above the daughter. And in his mind, he said, "Okay, tell me what happened to you." So he didn't say it out loud. I don't think it was more of a mental. He reached out to her mentally. Tell me what happened to you. Now it was just a kind of psychological exercise, right? He was just looking for the clues. He wasn't necessarily intending to speak directly to the spirit, but he, in his mind, said, "All right, tell me what happened to you." Well, the second after he said those words in his mind, the power went out in the house. So he's standing alone in complete darkness with two corpses, basically. And so that in itself was really unnerving, but the power popped back on in, a few seconds, and he didn't think much about it after that. Well, actually, he came out and he said, hey guys, because we were standing outside of the house doing some things, and he said, "Hey, did you guys notice the power going out? Like, did the power go out here on the street?" And we're like, "No, Mitch, we were standing here and the house lights were still on and all the other houses were still on. And no, the power didn't go out." So he's like, okay, that's interesting. But anyway, we still had 2 good days of work ahead of us, and, he didn't think anything else of it. So we wrap up the crime scene. go home, get back to life as normal as you can have in a law enforcement job. Anyway, so at the time, he had a pug named the Dude. And this pug is awesome. Well, he was. He's now deceased, but he was a really funny pug. And he had a really quirky personality, but he was pretty young around this time and was still kind of normal. So in the days and weeks after this crime scene had happened, after Mitch had been alone in the dark with these two deceased individuals, his dog started to act strangely. And so, for example, Mitch would come home from work, and the dog would be sitting in the middle of the room, looking up into the corner of the house, or looking up into the corner of the room, and then following something around. So he would look up at the corner, and then his eyes and his head would move, following something around the room that wasn't there. He was watching, and his eyes and head were tracking something that Mitch couldn't see what. And so he doesn't think too much of it. He's just like, oh, that crazy pug. Pugs are kind of known to be eccentric breeds. Well, the dog also started to freak out whenever Mitch would go up into his upstairs bathroom. He would go into that room, and all of a sudden the dog would just bark and spin and freak out and run around. And Mitch is like, what is your problem? Just had never behaved like that before. Well, Mitch also started to experience weird electrical phenomena in his house. His alarm clock would be blinking in the morning, even though the power hadn't been out. There was a battery backup in it. The alarm clock had just lost power for some reason. Sometimes the power in an entire room would go dark, and there was no explanation for it. The rest of the house was fine. He would check the circuit breaker. Nothing had happened. The power would disappear from a room. And so Mitch is starting to notice more and more of these weird things, the dog's weird behavior, these electrical problems, but he doesn't put it all together. He doesn't really know what to think until he starts to date a new gal. Now, this gal was an empath, and she was also pretty intuitive, and she could feel spirits. And so the first time she comes over to Mitch's house, she's like, oh, I know this sounds weird, but by the way, you have a ghost that's in this house. Mitch is like, what? And he's a really practical guy. And, he has he doesn't not believe in ghosts, but he hadn't gone there himself. You know what I mean? And so she's like, yeah, there's a ghost here. There's a spirit here. It's a female. And, she seems kind of agitated. And so they sit, and, she starts asking Mitch questions like, is your mom dead? Is your sister dead? She's just kind of going through this process of elimination, asking these questions. Eventually they come to the conclusion that this is the ghost of the daughter who had been murdered at that scene where he had been alone in the dark with her. And as best as this intuitive friend of his could tell, is that in that moment where Mitch had reached out to her psychically and said, tell me what's going on, or tell me what happened to you, she latched onto him psychically and then followed him home from the crime scene.
That's eerie. Makes you wonder when you ask for these ghosts to communicate with you or give you insights, what other permissions you're giving. Right.
And Mitch isn't alone. There's other people that I've talked to. I mean, his story's pretty drastic in that, so many weird things were happening, but there have been other investigators that I've talked to that have had, their children have seen something, they've had dreams, different things, their spouses have had dreams, and when they talked to him at all, it looked like a spirit had latched onto them and followed them home. And so, as crime scene investigators, we're always worried about what's on our boots. Like most people come home from work and go into their garage and strip down and have some clothes in there and new shoes to put on before they go in their house. I have a detached garage, so I always take my boots off before I go into the house. but, we're worried about tracking in blood or something gross to our house. What is following us home spiritually? Because, it does not seem to be an uncommon occurrence.
Very cool. All right, let's keep going. What are some of your other favorite stories we can look forward to in the new book, Fingerprints and Phantoms, that'll be coming out next year?
Well, Mitch seems to collect spirits, and so he has a story that is kind of the opposite of the first one, in that a spirit followed him to work rather than vice versa. And so this story is pretty funny because he once that intuitive friend of his had kind of helped him come to grips with this girl following him home, the occurrences of weirdness lessened somewhat. I mean, the dog would still act strange, but there weren't as many electrical problems, and he kind of just got used to, he wasn't freaked out about it, and he came to some kind of equilibrium with this ghost. Well, anyway, a while later, he sells this house and he moves to a house that his grandfather had lived in before he had passed away. So they had remodeled it, and his dog would kind of act weird in a certain room, but there wasn't a lot of things going on, and they thought, well, okay, these ghostly things are put behind us. Well, anyway, one day he had a call for service at a psychic shop. So it was one of those shops that sells crystals and psychic things, but they also do readings and different, palm readings and psychic readings and things like that. And so he goes to this place, and for a crime scene investigator doing a burglary investigation, you just usually start at the point of entry. You start to fingerprint there, and then you work your way inside the building and try to figure out what they've touched, or, do whatever you can to collect fingerprints. And so he does that. He starts at the point of entry, and he's working his way inside the building. Well, he's at the front desk, fingerprinting the counter and the cash register that had been broken into. Well, all of a sudden, one of the psychics comes out from a back room where she was trying to do a reading. And she's acting really funny. She's just kind of looking at Mitch, and she's like, hi. And Mitch is like, hi, yeah, how's it going? She's like, good. And you can tell, or Mitch could tell, this girl really was choosing her words carefully, mulling over her options. And eventually she says, do you have like a grandpa that is dead? And Mitch just looks around. He's like, well, yeah, my grandpa is dead. And she's like, did he really like fishing? And Mitch is like, well, yeah, actually, he loved fishing. That's all that he would do and talk about. And he loved fishing. And she's like, oh, okay. And Mitch is like, well, why? And she kind of blushed a little bit and smiled. And she's like, well, can you tell your grandpa to leave us alone? And Mitch is just confused. He's like, what are you talking about? She's like, well, we're back in the back trying to do a psychic reading, and he followed you to this crime scene, and now he's back telling us all about fishing, and we can't concentrate on our customer. Can you tell him to leave us alone? And at this point, Mitch is, he really doesn't know what to think, but he's like, hey, Grandpa, stop already, okay? And so the girl's like, okay, thanks, that's fine. And so she goes back in, and he finishes up what he was doing and heads out. But that was a funny story because, yeah, all of us are our relatives or people we loved. Are they following us around? Are they following us to our jobs? And so that was a kind of a funny story.
That's hilarious. And yeah, you got to wonder too. And that might be something. Maybe you give that a try on the job. And instead of asking for the spirit of the dead person, maybe ask one of your relatives or spirit guides, can you help me out here? Can you connect me with this person? What can they tell me? What information can they give me? And see, I would think that might be a really cool way to interact and open up an even bigger scope. Like if the ghost is there and confused and unsure of what's going on, maybe by having a guide or another spirit come in, they can help out and get you more information.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, yeah, who knows to what extent?
Your Honor, I'd like to play this audio recording from Beyond the Darkness, as our expert witness has just spoken to a radio show host who thinks that he should ask the dead and angels to help him solve this crime.
Yep.
Paul, maybe my suggestions are not the best thing for your career, but I'm going to throw them out there anyway.
Well, you just have to be able to write it in your report correctly, right?
Right, exactly.
Well, fortunately, the things I deal with a lot are things that, like fingerprints and different examinations that have some definite hard aspects to them that are out of the realm of the spirit. So I think I'm okay.
Very cool. All right, I know time is going to get away from us here. Let's power through on a couple more of your favorite stories.
Well, one of the really, or I've put these creepy stories in the book, and those are probably my favorite. But I've also put kind of some funny stories in there too. And
we love humor. Yeah, let's lighten it up and hear a couple of those too.
Well, probably the one that I really love had to do with my brother, whose name you'll like. His name is Dave, my older brother Dave.
Sounds like a believable guy.
Great guy. And so he's a security guard, and he was working at a site where the different security guards that were there, some of the older guys, were always trying to freak him out and scare him by telling him that the place was haunted. And so they would it sounds like there was a lot of hazing going on. They'd even jump out at him at different times. And, sounds like, these guys were kind of mean about it. But one night he's at this site alone, and he's, at the station where the different closed circuit TV monitors are. And, he has it in the back of his mind that his coworkers are telling him this place is haunted all the time. And so he looks on one of the monitors, and a door opens up by itself, and he sees this misty white figure kind of shake across the camera. And he's like, what was that? And then the door closed and the misty figure went away. So he's like, whoa, that was weird. Did I see what I thought I saw? It was kind of out of the corner of his eyes a little bit. And so he's watching that monitor now really intently, bearing in mind that his coworkers were always trying to mess with him. And as he looks at this monitor, all of a sudden he sees that white misty figure pass in front of the camera again. And he's like, oh man, that was not an illusion. I saw that. I know I saw that. So he's like, well, let's see if it happens again. And so he's sitting at his station, and all of a sudden he sees that figure pass in front of the camera again. And he's like, something weird is going on. Like, no one's in this building. That door opened, and now I see this figure. Something is really, something strange is going on. So he debates what to do. He's kind of freaked out, but eventually he's like, all right, I got to go check this out. So he goes down to the camera where he saw the scene, and he looks up, and there's a large cobweb hanging down by the side of the camera. And whenever some wind or something would disturb it, it would just pass, that cobweb would just pass in front of the camera and then float back. And he figures that it was the wind that popped that door open and got that cobweb going. And so he was just like, oh my gosh, he's just like, I really thought there was something strange there, but it was just a cobweb. And so we had a good laugh at that story because he knew that I was collecting them too.
Well, cobwebs are 100 times more terrifying than any demon. I've been in dark, scary basements where we'll hear growling, and I'll walk towards it, and all of a sudden something brushes across my face, and I'm screaming like a 2-year-old girl. If it's a cobweb, I'm done. Demon in the corner, let me go see what we're looking at here.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, because maybe a cobweb has a spider on it. But.
Yeah, right, exactly. And they're living and going to put me in the grave, so I've got to be really worried about that.
That's right.
I love it when you have some fun ones. And I've had I had a couple of stories. A buddy of mine who's a cop out in Wisconsin, he said that they were on an investigation. He had gone into the house, and his partner was going to go back around the back of the house and check. And as he's walking through the house doing this walkthrough, suddenly he starts to hear heavy footsteps coming up behind him. And he sees something out of the corner of his eye that flashes past the back window. So he knows his partner's back there. And he's in this panic mode, and he flings around, and there's nothing behind him, but he heard the footsteps. So he kind of shakes it off and does a little look around to make sure that nobody's going to jump out and surprise him. And he turns his back and starts backing up into the room he was heading, and he's just keeping an eye behind him, and his partner is now behind him. And he bumps right into him. He said, I screamed like a 3-year-old, and I just wanted to get the hell out of there until my partner said, whoa, simmer down, what's wrong? So here you got the tough cop in there trying to case this place, and he gets flipped out just by a couple of little sounds in the house, and then screams. And that was my favorite part. He goes, and I unabashedly, Dave, I will just admit, I screamed like a little girl the minute I bumped into him. It was something straight out of Scooby-Doo.
Well, did he have it on body cam, or was that before body cams?
This was quite a few years back. I would say probably about 8 or 9 years back from when he was telling me.
That would have been great blackmail material there. Had been caught on the body cam.
Yeah, to have his partner watch him back into him, then wah!
Yeah. Well, probably my favorite funny story from the book has to do with, officers in law enforcement, we deal with people that are mentally ill all the time. Unfortunately, that is a big deficiency in our system where, there's so many people suffering from mental illness, and the system kind of throws some pills at them and says, good luck, I mean, it's a big deficiency, and a lot of home problems with homelessness and some of the shootings that happened. I mean, you can directly link that to mental illness. And so, the officers run into the mentally ill all the time. And there was this lady who the officers had constant dealings with her, and she had been diagnosed with mental illness. They knew she was mentally ill, and she would always call the officers to her house saying that there were ghosts in it. And so the officers would come, and they'd walk through, and they didn't see anything, and they could tell this woman was having some problems. Well, one day they kind of got fed up of going repeatedly to this place, and so they got this idea. So they grabbed their radar guns, the guns that they use to track how fast cars are coming, so they can write tickets. Well, when you push the button on these guns, they beep a little bit. And so the officers went into the house on, the latest call that there's ghosts in the house, and they said, ma'am, we have these new ghost zapping guns. Like, if we use these guns to shoot the ghosts, they won't come back. So they walk around the house with their radar guns beeping, just pulling the triggers, beep,
awesome.
beep, as they walk around. Right. And the lady's looking really impressed, and they said, all right, the ghosts are gone. They won't bother you anymore. We've zapped them. They leave. The woman never called them back to another house.
Right. You know why, though, right? Because all the ghosts are like, we got to leave. Those guys are nuts. Those aren't ghost guns.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I either thought, well, maybe it helped her, or maybe she thought, oh, what a bunch of jerks.
Exactly.
I never to call them, but I got a chuckle out of that story.
That's awesome. Fantastic. Very cool. All right, let's keep it moving. What's your next story for us?
Well, I think at this point, before I talk about more ghost stories, I think it's really important for you guys in radio to know how much radio, podcasts, things like this mean to us in law enforcement. So when you work nights, there's so much tedium, there's so much loneliness, there's just times where, you don't see another soul for hours on a cold winter night. Having radio, having something interesting to listen to, something that stimulates your mind, something that it's so valuable to get you through those nights. I mean, I can't tell you how many nights I've had where it's like the only thing you have to look forward to is like, oh, what's on Coast to Coast tonight, or oh, what's on Dave's latest podcast, and people, different officers knowing that, I've done these things and been on Coast to Coast. So, we always talk about, oh, what's on Coast tonight, and oh, this, or, it's so, I can't even tell you how important it is for just the sanity of so many people to have good radio like this. And I know truck drivers, and they have the long hauls to run, and they just really rely on having something good like this. Political talk radio, all the same. sports radio, all the same. But paranormal radio, your podcasts and different things, it's wonderful. And so I just wanted to, thank you on behalf of all the guys I know, because it gets you through so many lonely, dark nights. I can't even tell you.
I really appreciate hearing that. I know both Tim and I do. I stand behind law enforcement and emergency techs and ambulance drivers and fire department. And my son is a fireman here in the Twin Cities, and he tells me that his buddies will be like, "What's your last name?" "Schrader." "Huh. Are you any relation to?" And my son just rolls his eyes and shakes his head. And I like that we're part of that nighttime world. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you've heard the story, Paul, but when we were doing about 5 years ago, we were talking pretty heavily about the Black-Eyed Kids. And we did I think, a big episode on Black-Eyed Kids. And a few days later, we get a cop that tells us, he goes, "Listen, we love your show. We listen to it. My partner and I laugh at the stupid stories that people share. We get a kick out of it. We love the paranormal. We just don't believe in it." And he said, "And you guys are doing that Black-Eyed Kids, and we're laughing about these stories, and just they're so bizarre. They're so weird, and they've obviously just urban legend, these Black-Eyed Kids." And he goes, "And then you guys told a really creepy one about the woman here in Minnesota where she woke up to find 3 of them next to their bed." He says, "You just finish that story and go to commercial break." And he goes, "And our radio clicks on, and there's a call that a woman is complaining there are 3 teenagers in her yard she does not know, and they won't leave." And he goes, "So I looked at my partner, he looked at me and said, 'Oh, F that,' and flipped off the radio and refused to take the call." And I'm like, yes. I love that we're getting into their minds. So even the cops are out there going, "Oh, no, not going to do that."
The Black-Eyed Kids are freaky.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you have you stumbled upon any of those encounters yet with the law enforcement, either getting complaints or seeing something themselves?
No, I haven't heard any stories here locally of any of that. No, we do have some good Bigfoot encounters, though.
Well, go ahead. We're always good for a couple of Bigfoot encounters. We'll steal those from you before we let you go for the night.
So the city where we work, Ogden, the mountains are literally they're right next to us. Like, I can leave my police station and be in a very mountainous area in 10 minutes drive. Like, the mountains are really on top of us. And so there are some stories that come across every now and again. One I heard from an older cop. He retired not too long after I started, so he was one of the old timers. But he was up in Ogden Canyon, and it had just snowed, like a little skiff of snow, half an inch, quarter of an inch kind of thing. And he was parked at this certain area. Once again, they pull off somewhere to write their reports or, do whatever. And he got out of his truck for some reason. I can't remember why he got out. And right by his truck were these enormous bear footprint, not bear as in rawr bear, but, unshod, human-looking footprints walking in the snow not too far of where his truck was. And they were huge. They were, you could see the toes and the foot, but they were way bigger than any normal human footprint could be. And he's an experienced hunter, tracker, all those things, and he had never seen anything like it. And so that's just right up the canyon from us. Even further up, if you go further up the canyon, there's some really remote mountainous areas. And another officer, it's funny, kind of the different theme. He was a little bit hesitant to tell me this story because he was afraid I was going to make fun of him. But when I said, "Oh, no, dude, I collect these stories all the time," and I talked about, some of the stuff, he's like, okay, he finally trusted me. But he's also an experienced hunter. Out here in the West, it seems like a lot of guys who like guns and hunting and different things are drawn into law enforcement. And so the hunting culture is really big in our officers out here. Experienced hunter, spends a lot of time in the backcountry, knows what animals are there. He's seen bears, he's seen mountain lions, all those things. He's driving along this dark road one night, heading up way far up into the mountains, and he comes around this bend and his lights pan onto the middle of the road, and there is a 7 to 8 foot tall bipedal hairy being walking across the road. Now, the detail that he really puts in there that's important is he said he was describing the arms, swinging and loping as this creature was walking. And he's like, I thought, is that a bear? But he's like, no, bears, if they walk on hind legs, their front paws are just kind of perched up by their chests. And he's like, I clearly saw the arms of this creature swinging in, just loose, like a person just kind of walking like Shaggy. You brought up Scooby-Doo, how when Shaggy walked.
Like, yeah, man, I totally understand.
Yeah, his arms just kind of swung. He described very specifically he saw the arms swinging like that. And he's like, that was no bear. Bears don't walk like that.
Right.
And he was actually kind of shaken up about it. And I think I may have been the first person he'd ever told that story to. And, once again, he didn't seek me out. He wasn't looking for glory or whatever. Whatever the skeptics say, oh, they're just crazy people looking for attention. I had to pull that story from him. I had to kind of dig it out. And then the third officer who encountered a Bigfoot, this was up in the Pacific Northwest. I guess this kind of fits into more of that classic encounter up there. He was in the service, and they were doing maneuvers way out into the forest one night, and they were bedded down in their tent and, just trying to get some sleep because they had to get up early in the morning to do their compass work or whatever. Well, all of a sudden they're in the tent and they smell a horrible, horrible, horrible smell. Just that horrible, skunky, nasty, dirty smell that they had never really smelled before. And they're like, what is that smell? They're like, oh my goodness, they're just really freaking out. All of a sudden they hear a ripping sound, like a wood or branch ripping, and a branch falls down onto their tent. And so they scramble on out of there. They're really freaked out, the smell and everything. And so they just get out of there, leave their tent behind and everything, and take off. Well, in the morning when they come back, they see that the branch that had fallen on their tent had been ripped from the tree. It wasn't a dead branch. It was a fresh branch, and something had ripped and torn it from the tree about 10 feet up above the height of their tent. There's no way a person could have reached up there. No other animal, no mountain lion that climbs a tree rips a branch bodily out of there. And they were pretty convinced. They didn't really see any other evidence, but they were pretty convinced from the smell and where that branch had been ripped off that they had had a Bigfoot encounter, even though they hadn't seen him. So, once again, they didn't seek me out. I had to kind of dig for this story. And, kind of back to our original premise, like how can I, a person of the law, say these things and still be credible in court? I don't know what they saw. I'm not gonna turn into the big investigator that writes a book of theories or whatever, but something happened to these guys. And because of the way I'm trained to think, I'm not going to dismiss it out of hand. I don't have evidence to disprove what they saw. I think these guys are credible. Something happened to them, and I'm going to take it at face value.
Paul, fascinating stories. I thank you so much for joining us and giving us some insights on this, and a cute little preview, if you will, of Fingerprints and Phantoms that'll be coming out next year. Hey, do you have any UFO stories that you might be able to leave us with?
I don't. That's one area where, of all the kind of different stories that I've talked to the officers and different people, I have not heard of any good UFO stories. I mean, I know out here in Utah with Dugway Proving Grounds and all the different things out there, there's stuff around. But yeah, I've never been told a story or seen anything myself.
Well, keep us updated, sir, and we wish you much luck and success. And if people want to send you their stories, if they are in law enforcement or EMTs, fire department, and they've had these experiences, how can they reach out to you?
So that would be great. And the different times that I have been on Coast to Coast, I've got a lot of good stories from people reaching out to me. The best way is to go to Facebook. So my first novel that I wrote, I have a Facebook page. It's called The Lost Stones. So if you go to Facebook and search The Lost Stones, message me on that channel or do whatever on that page. That's where I do a lot of interacting with different people that
I'll make sure we have a link up for that so that they can find it and make that available. Paul, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your week and enjoy your weekend here. And we'll look forward to talking to you again in the future.
All right, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
That's it. We'll be back again next week with more of the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Beyond the Darkness.